Rob, look, thank you very much for talking to me today. And just to introduce you, so you're the CEO of Arbtech, so one of the UK's leading arboricultural and ecological consultancies. You're a Royal Chartered Biologist, rated in the Times Top 50 Business Leaders of LDC Disruptor Awards 2024. That sounds really interesting, I have to say. It'd be great to know more about that. And you are a respected commentator on national policy and legislation. Rob, thank you very much for joining me today, like I say, and chewing over what is actually quite a well, it is a chewy issue, isn't it, really? The planning and infrastructure bill. So thank
Yeah,
you.
that's right. Thank you very
Okay.
much for having me.
No, delighted. Right, okay, so just to kick off then, so the planning and infrastructure bill, it's currently at committee stage. And so how far-reaching are the consequences for the bill as is? Because it touches everything, doesn't it? The planning and infrastructure bill, it affects everybody. So does our planning system need overhauling? And what's working and what's not working and for who?
Oh, big question. I'll try and take it in parts. Um, the bill is very far-reaching. The planning system could use some improvement, to say the least. And there are various components to that. If you, it's such a big topic that I'm gonna try and break this up into relatively logical chunks, but it's not, they're overlapping. Even if you looked at housing delivery and you wrote a list of all of the problems with housing delivery, and then you re-ranked that list in descending order of magnitude of deleterious effect, I don't think the planning system's anywhere near the top 10 because there are all kinds of things like construction skills shortage, there's interest rates, there's whether or not people can save deposits in a cost of living crisis, there's all kinds of things. I don't think the planning system's in the top 10. It's not great, but I don't think it's in the top 10. Even if you said it was in the top 10, you then got to do the same exercise again, essentially. What are all the problems with the planning system? And I personally don't think BATs and newts, among other things, are anywhere near the top 10. So I feel like falling the first hurdle, the government is putting an awful lot of emphasis and focus on things that simply don't clog up the planning system and aren't blockers necessarily to housing delivery. I don't really agree that protected species within planning and planning within housing delivery are the biggest problems that the government could focus on. But that's what they've chosen to do.
Why do you think that is then?
Why do I think they've chosen to do that?
Yeah.
Well, I'm clearly speculating, so I'd like to get that out there.
That's
I'll
fine.
preface everything I'm saying with I feel like bats and newts, which are the rhetoric that's peddled by people like Rachel Reeves, who work in the Treasury and don't really have anything to do with planning. Bats and newts are an easy scapegoat. Bats are a very, very easy scapegoat after the BAT tunnel debacle, even though, as somebody rightly pointed out on LinkedIn, and it pains me that I can't think of the name to credit them for it, but it's not a BAT tunnel, it's a train tunnel that bats go around, hopefully. But when you have large government projects, infrastructure projects, and you've got arm's length government agencies signing off essentially blank checks to tier one contractors and all the usual suspects as consultants, if you say to somebody or a group of people within that organization, we need to avoid this particular important Wettgenstein's roost at all costs. If you're putting your train line through it, it's going to be a very expensive solution. And of course, building a tunnel is not a cheap exercise. Cladding it for fireproofing isn't a cheap exercise, all of those things. So the actual, probably the BAT mitigation element of that should have been a teeny tiny fraction of what was actually spent. But there you are. Somebody somewhere signed that off. Somebody somewhere said that was a good idea, or a group of people did. Those people should be named and shamed. Those people should be fired. Don't blame the bats for that. But I feel like because of stories like that, and this is what I'm talking about, that tail end of the distribution where occasionally protected species cause enormous cost to a development, either because good advice has been ignored or because good advice wasn't procured in the first place, or sometimes, very, very occasionally, because you've taken good advice and you didn't ignore it, but there is an overriding kind of factor, like building a hospital is probably an overriding factor, I'd argue. It might be very expensive to mitigate for. And it's very, very easy to generate press around that. And it's very, very easy to build the rhetoric around that. And so partly, cynically, I think it's because it's an easy scapegoat, and then partly because if you're going to throw the bathwater out, you might as well throw the baby as well. So there are elements of environmental regulation that, from a planning point of view, definitely need streamlining. I've been a really vocal advocate for streamlining ecology input to planning applications for a number of years now. I don't think the way that the government is going about it right this second is what I would call anything close to ideal. But I do think, you know, they were kind of, it was like, the best way I can describe it is like it's a really good concept with absolutely terrible execution. I was almost swore right there, but and what I think the government needs is some really small amendments that would make it good in execution and good in concept and good in execution.
Yeah. And potentially one of the most regressive parts of the whole bill is Section 3 and the implications for protected species and habitats. And you talked there in the beginning about the importance of them, you know, and I guess it's, well, where do we go from here now? You know, could you just sort of talk me through your concerns? You've spoken to Chris Grayling fairly recently, Lord Grayling, and voiced your concerns. I know you're talking to a lot of people. Could you just kind of very specifically set out what it is that you're worried about those particular part or that particular part of the bill?
Yeah, again, I'll have to take this in parts, and some of them may be overlapping. I have a number of concerns about the way the bill is trying to frame the problem of streamlining ecology, particularly, but also other. And I would say again, there are some really good use cases for both the way Part 3 is constructed and the Nature Restoration Fund, and how, you know. I'll start with the good use cases, because I'm a big believer in not just complaining about something, but credit where it's due. If you take a problem like nutrient pollution, which is in the vast majority caused by the need for wastewater treatment upgrades by utilities companies and also by intensive agriculture, it's very, very difficult to it's very, very difficult to put a levy or a tax through either of those systems. And it's not within the competence of a developer, nor should it be really, for them to tackle those problems. So there is a bit of a trade-off here, whereby intensive agriculture isn't really profitable enough in order to levy to sort out the nutrient pollution problem from their point of view. And you clearly can't ask people like BBOWT Redrow to go into utility companies and start upgrading wastewater treatment works, because one, they shouldn't have to, and two, it's not really within their competence. And it's particularly not within their competence to do things like building wetlands, where, you know, you have a conservation covenant for 100 years of monitoring and maintenance. That seems like a pretty onerous burden on a developer as well. So the Nature Restoration Fund for things like nutrient pollution, water scarcity, SANG maybe as well. Great concept, great execution. Small tax on a large number of dwellings over a period of time, whether that's this parliament or otherwise. You think about it, if they're going to build 1.5 million homes, if that happens, and you tax each of those homes £1,000, it's 1.5 billion. You could probably do something pretty good with that as far as nutrient pollution is concerned. It makes that to me makes an awful lot of sense. What I don't like about Part 3 is, firstly, the sanitization of legally protected species and habitats. I intentionally dislike things like barn owls being labeled an environmental feature, because it distorts how people should be viewing different environmental protections. I don't like the idea that somebody could pay a levy and then go and drive a bulldozer or a brush cutter or through habitat that might contain, if it's riparian, water voles, otters. If it's not riparian, mammals like badgers, birds, barn owls, bats, all kinds of things. They shouldn't just be thrown through a wood chipper because somebody's paid a levy. If you're going to disperse, displace, harm, or kill animals, and you're doing that knowingly because you paid a levy, there's something really wrong with that. I think everybody can appreciate that. And I think the public would appreciate that as well, which I think is why there's been this kind of branding exercise done to call these things environmental features rather than describe them, rather than call a spade and say, actually, we're going to hell with the barn owls, we're going to throw them through a wood chipper in the name of development and growth. So what I don't like is the sanitization of different environmental features. What I don't like is the way that they're treated the same, in that the Natural England is supposed to reduce an environment delivery plan with a tariff for maybe nutrient pollution, maybe sand, maybe a couple of other things that might make an awful lot of sense. But ancient semi-natural woodland, irreplaceable habitats, I mean, it should be obvious to even a 5-year-old that you can't replace the ecological functionality of a 500-year-old woodland by compulsory purchasing some farmer's land somewhere and planting up a load of tree whips and saying, oh, look, it's okay. It's actually, I think the test in the bill is it's an overall improvement. I mean, it's clearly not an overall improvement, right? And that assumes that you've used all of the NRF for the tree planting, not for the compulsory purchase of the land, not for the, and I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to be negative about Natural England, but they're not exactly famously pro-developer. And there's clearly some level of bureaucracy required in order to produce EDPs, to monitor EDPs, to revise EDPs, to, you know.
Yeah.
So an awful lot of that NRF is going to get eaten up by Natural England and compulsory purchase, and not actually go into nature restoration, which makes it, I would think, very difficult for it to meet the overall improvement test. Just, you know, very simple arithmetic or economics. The thing that there are two more kind of insidious risks with the notion of EDPs, a fixed tariff, pay your bill, and then do what you like. The first is from a developer's point of view. If I'm a developer of a site and I'm responsible, and there are lots of good ones out there, including the large builders, despite what people might say, I have a significant vested interest in engaging with the mitigation hierarchy properly, starting with avoidance, then going through the various steps, because I want to incorporate nature into my site where it's practicable, because there's an ocular framework that's very difficult to recreate. If you cut down a woodland, it's very, very difficult to replace that in terms of its landscape amenity and its impact on the site's character. That actually has an impact on house prices and and how quickly those prices will sell, how quickly those houses will sell. So, I mean, my MBA thesis was on ecological economics, the impact of mature trees on house prices. So I know this to a certainty. You can charge more money for a house that's got mature trees near it, on average. Again, mean of the distribution, right? And so developers actually have got a vested interest in making places where people can connect with and benefit from or access nature, both in terms of the margins that they can command and in terms of their kind of reputational equity going forward. Nobody wants to create featureless ghettos where it's like a concrete jungle. So from a developer's point of view, I don't like the idea that there's going to be several overlapping layers of EDP, because if you do an EDP for nutrient pollution at the catchment level, you're either going to have to do a lot of guesswork, like grid it out and say, within each of these grid squares, you pay this much for killing a barn owl and this much for killing a bat and so on. I just don't think that works very well. So there's going to be different EDPs at different scales. That makes it even more difficult for developers to build that into their viability assessments. I don't like the idea that developers that are responsible and want to retain nature where practicable within their site, either for reasons that it's additive to their margin or for reasons that they're just responsible. In the case of social house builders, for example, who don't sell their sites, they retain them and then lease them out to housing associations. I don't like the idea that those people that are doing things responsibly are actively subsidizing those people that aren't. Because if you have to pay a levy for something, and then you also want to retain some natural features within your site, you're paying twice. And again, despite what you may read or you may think, development is not a fabulously profitable, super easy way of making money. It's a very, very difficult game. It requires patient capital. There's an awful lot of risk. It's very, very illiquid. And people lose money often as make money. So from a developer's point of view, I don't think it's a great, as drafted, the bill isn't great. There's no optionality built in for developers to opt in and opt out of things. If you think about communities at the lower end of the socioeconomic strata, so mostly communities with significant amounts of social housing, the margins on building social housing is very, very, very low. You're encouraging the stripping of habitats repeatedly out of low-income communities because there isn't the margin in social housing to put back great spaces if you're having to pay a significant levy. And so what you're going to end up with is increasingly more dense, more grey, more concrete social housing.
Yeah.
communities, but it's okay because we're taking some of that NRF money and somewhere else in the county or perhaps even in the country, we're going to buy a farmer's field and plant some trees. And I actually asked Sarah Gibson, who's a Lib Dem MP, to put that question specifically to Steve Reed in the Environment Audit Committee, and she did. In fact, I put the clip of it on my LinkedIn if anybody's interested. She asked Steve Reed how he was going to make sure that these communities had access to that new green space that was being created. And he fumbled the answer. He clearly didn't have one and didn't expect that question, because he said in the coming days, and then corrected himself and said months, you're going to hear from my department how we're going to connect those people with these new green spaces that are going to be built somewhere, constructed, installed, however you want to describe it somewhere else. So then in my head, I'm thinking, okay, maybe in like Wythenshawe on the outskirts of Manchester, which is a lower income community, a slightly impoverished community, you're going to strip the habitats out of there, put really dense social housing, because it's the only way you can make the maths work, by not putting any habitats back and not doing anything, kind of no green infrastructure. Then you're going to go near, I don't know, somewhere in Cheshire and buy a few fields and stick some trees and a pond and a lake and everything else in it. That's cool. But people then, who are the poorest people in our communities, have to spend money and time they don't have to travel to go and benefit from and access nature. So are you going to build transport infrastructure deep into the heart of all of these rural communities where you're going to put this? Because you're buying farmers' land, you're compulsory purchasing land, so it's a rural community. Are you going to build new bus links and new train links there? Is it going to be like Disneyland, where there's massive car parks next to these strategic offset sites so that people can park their car up and then go and have a walk around? It just, you know, I'm not being too extreme. I'm presenting very real problems that people simply haven't thought through. So that's another problem I have with the bill. The first problem is I don't think it's very fair to developers. It doesn't improve their ability to predict costs. And we haven't got to the biggest problem of all, which is that it doesn't actually speed up the planning system. But I don't think it's very fair to developers. Some will end up subsidizing others. That's not a great place to be. I don't think it's very fair to communities, particularly those who are not rural and you know, inner city impoverished communities at all, because it literally encourages the only way you can make your internal rate of return, which is the hurdle rate above which or below which you don't do a project. The only way you can make that IRR work is by densely packing things in and stripping nature out. I don't like the idea that you can brand legally protected species. I mean, your Wildlife Trust's logo is a badger, right? I don't like the idea that you can pay a levy and drive an excavator through a live badger set. And then finally, I intensely dislike the notion that if you remove the ecology profession altogether from the planning system, it doesn't make planning applications, it doesn't get planning applications validated or determined any faster.
Brilliant. I mean, there was so much in that, you know, kind of ranging from, you know, people in kind of more disadvantaged communities, and you know, there's a whole burden around the NHS that, you know, that you're kind of getting into health inequalities and all sorts, aren't you? And I mean, that is huge, and it's absolutely huge in itself. And then kind of, yes, talking about maybe not pausing, but going for amendments, and you know, particularly laying down as many as we can at the moment to get the conversation then into the Lords. I'm just wondering then, because obviously we had committee stage last week. And when asked about environmental regression, Marion Spain, she didn't directly answer the question. And I think that led MPs to say, well, you support it then, basically. So, you know, what's your take on that?
I've not met her, and so I don't want to be. I'm probably more fiercely critical privately than I would be if I'm saying something publicly.
Absolutely.
But I've got Marion's exact words in front of me, because I had a member of staff go through the bill and pass out every answer she gave to a question. And so her exact words on resourcing, for example, to deliver EDPs were, in terms of resourcing, in principle, yes, the resourcing should be adequate. I find that difficult to believe, but nevertheless. I think the risk is in the early years of the scheme when the levy is not yet flowing. So clearly the resourcing is not adequate. But we need to get upfront and do those delivery plans so they are ready when developers are ready to contribute. So I made a freedom of information request to Natural England recently to say, how many environment delivery plans are currently being drafted? The answer is 0. So she either hasn't been, she either doesn't have a very good grip on her department, or alternatively, some of the staff are not being entirely truthful with her. And then she said, on the Nature Recovery Fund, she said, we are confident this will be an improvement on the current system. We have already run versions of the Nature Recovery Fund for recreational impact, for great crested newts, and for nutrient mitigation. So we have seen enough that these schemes can work. We are confident they will work. Well, that's fine, but the thing about science is you're supposed to use the best available evidence. And if the available evidence says it works for newts, that's wonderful. But then you need to look at what other animals behave like newts, or have an ecology or a life cycle akin to newts. And the reason it works quite well for newts, these sort of district licensing offset schemes, and there's, you know, lots of schools have thought about this, but let's just, it's a whole different discussion. We'll put it to one side and say it works. The reason it works is because newts can very easily become ecologically isolated. And then populations have lower extinction resilience because they're not breeding with other larger metapopulations. And so it does make an awful lot of sense that if you want to take out one pond with some newts and put 4 ponds back somewhere else where there are definitely lots of newts, and those ponds are monitored and this program's successful, it makes an awful lot of sense to keep doing that. And then you might be able to look at, well, what else behaves like that? Maybe common reptiles do. Not all reptiles, not rare reptiles, but common reptiles might do it. Okay, fair enough, cool. Do bats work in the same way that newts work? Are bats at risk of becoming ecologically isolated? Probably not, because they're mobile species that travel in 3 dimensions rather than 2, and over really short distances. Do birds work like that, or do they come home to nest in the same sites or make the same use of the site year after year after year? Yes, they probably do. Do barn owls work like that? You know, barn owls work the same as bats, but the same as other birds. They don't work the same way as, you know, they don't operate, they don't live the same way newts live. And so I don't think you can say, well, it works for newts and nutrient pollution, so we should do exactly the same thing for barn owls. That statement is fundamentally stupid, and you should be using the best available evidence. And since I have been through the corpus of scientific literature and can't find a single word anywhere, I then bothered myself to go to Natural England and DEFRA and MHCLG and put in a freedom of information request to say, what tests, pilots, trials, studies, scientific literature you may come across that I can't find using my own resources, what do you have that points to this being that points to the best available evidence suggesting that what works for newts is going to work for everything else, or what works for nutrient pollution is going to work for animals, or what works for nutrient pollution is going to work for ancient semi-natural woodland? So far, I've had one response. I'm due the rest of them by the 20th of May. Natural England have come back and said, we don't have anything.
Right.
So,
okay.
Mariam, you're wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
On EDPs and protected species, she says, again, her exact words, I think that where we will look next will include a certain number of protected species. The commonest species of bats are likely to be able to benefit from the measures, similar measures as for newts. These are her words as they were spoken.
Yeah.
It is not yet all protected species, and we do not yet know which. So I cannot give you a definitive answer. I think it will be the next financial year when we start to roll out these further plans. So in her first sentence, she said, sorry, in her earlier answer, she said, this is fine, and we'll get these EDP schemes up and running as soon as possible for developers. And in the next answer, she says, I'm actually not sure. I can't give you a definitive answer, and it'll probably be the next financial year before we start looking at this. But we're probably going to do it for the commonest species of bats. And what is it about the commonest species of bats? What it is about their nature, their ecology, their biology, that means that they are any different to a rarer species of bats in the way they behave, in the way they breed, in the way they feed, in the way they hibernate? It's an open question for you.
It's an open. Exactly. Well, none.
I mean, I've got an awful lot more. I've got her every word if you want to go through that. But if you don't, essentially, I think she did a very, very good job of ducking questions, not giving definitive answers. And I think there is no basis in science for most of what she said. Also, her own department have written to me to tell me that there are no EDPs being drafted, and also that they have no trials, tests, cohort studies, whatever else, to point to strategic mitigation being better than site-by-site mitigation. And that brings me on to something that I would like to wedge into this conversation if it's possible.
Go for it.
I intentionally dislike the word strategic. in this context, because that tends to imply you have a well-formed plan. But leaving that aside, if you don't have really good evidence to show that what you're going to do is going to work and be an overall improvement or better somehow, you are speculating. If you have no evidence, you are speculating. Mm. Another word for speculating is gambling. And what gambling in really small ways can be productive. So if you ran a couple of pilots for this, for different types of species, that's a gamble. It might not pay off, but at the same time, it could have a huge benefit, which would either demonstrate definitively one way or the other, this works, this does not work at a species level for different environmental features. So gambling could be good, but when you are going to go wholesale and do this at a national level over the entire country with no evidence whatsoever, the probability of the outcome doesn't change because you use the word strategic. All that happens is that you've raised the stakes. Yeah. And so if there is an invisible threshold somewhere below which irreversible decline occurs for any species, locally or nationally, it's a very significant gamble that what you're about to do is not going to breach that threshold. Because if you batter a population repeatedly, you destroy its habitat, you starve it of a food source, you do all of these things which are very combative. At no point do badgers or bats put their hand up and say, actually, if you keep doing this, we're going to go extinct next time.
Yeah.
All that happens is you breach that threshold of irreversible decline, and there is no coming back, because that's what irreversible means. Yeah.
So, Robert, in terms of sort of win-win, we, the government has an agenda for growth, and it's based on GDP. They're seeing house building as one of those mechanisms to be able to, kind of re-energize our economy. We know that it is possible to build good houses with nature. And I think that there probably is a win-win situation. The way that we're going at the moment with the bill, do you think that we are going to achieve that? Or, what would your kind of final words be to say, hang on a minute, no, let's just have a think about this in summary?
My final words would be, if you want to protect growth, then you need to put 100% of your effort into a trade negotiation with the United States, because that's likely to have a much bigger dent in our GDP than any amount of house building will or won't. But in the context of the bill, I think the bill is going to get rammed through with very little amendments.
Okay.
But I think that the amendments that people are tabling now are incredibly important. And if you haven't written to your MP already and requested a meeting, then do that. And as we discussed in our brief chat before we live recorded, I had all of my employees I created a template letter for all of my employees, if they wish, to write to their own MP and request a meeting, and also request a question be put to the housing minister, a written question. And we had a wide variety of responses. Most Liberal, Democrat and Conservative responses were extremely positive. Some Labour responses were extremely positive. And I have an enormous amount of respect for somebody who's prepared to say, I don't agree with what the party's doing. Actually, I want to stand up for what's right. And there are some really good examples of that in Labour. But we had quite a few people who got a template letter response back. And and these were in different regions of the UK where the response was literally word for word identical. And so what we did was call BS on that. We wrote back to them and said, you've given me an answer for a question I didn't ask. I'd like my actual question answered, and I'd like you also to agree to meet me. And so I would, and that's been very successful. I would encourage people to write to their MP, demand a meeting, get across in a very concise way some of the points that you feel strongly about, because you may not agree with everything I've said today, and ask them to table those amendments. Because if they can table those amendments, it goes in the committee report and that goes to the Lords. And then what I would also encourage people to do is start engaging the Lords. You can write to them just like anybody else. All of their email addresses are available on the government website. I've found them, I've spoke to 12 so far. I've found them to be incredibly responsive, very, very, and they have a little bit of freedom as compared to a Labour MP, where they can say what they really think, because the career consequences aren't quite so severe.
Yes.
So I would encourage people to do that, because I do think this will get kicked around a lot in the Lords.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Look, I mean, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Robert, for talking to me. There's so much in there to unpack, to take away, to digest, but all really sage words, I have to say, and great actually to get an insight into the house builder side of things, because I think that, you know,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
absolutely part of the debate that
if
we just have not heard yet.
yeah, if you want to see what house builders think, the House Builders Federation wrote their own written evidence to the Bill Committee, and it asks some significant questions of part 3. I would
Yeah,
encourage everybody to go and read that. And
yeah,
if you can do, send that to your MP as well and ask them to read it.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, look, I mean, I hope it doesn't come to us lying down in front of the bulldozers. I hope we get to a point where something sensible does happen.
I hope that the ENGOs mobilize their membership,
Yeah,
because I'm slightly disappointed that some ENGOs have not mobilized their membership and said, look, there is a very real risk here I mean, I'm going to use the RSPB as an example, not because they're not doing the right thing, but because they have a huge membership.
yeah,
You can go and look at birds free of charge anytime you like, anywhere. And if people are paying membership to an organization, it's probably because they really care about those birds. If they knew what was really at stake here, which is that birds' nests, nesting bird checks, all of these things that happen right now, that's going out of the window because you can just cut trees down, you can bulldoze scrubland, you can throw it all through a brush cutter because you paid a levy. I think those 1 or 2 million members of these various ENGOs might have something to say about it, and they might want to write to their MPs as well.
yeah,
So
absolutely. I would say that's coming very soon, actually.
I hope
Okay.
so. I really hope
Okay.
so. Thank you so much for your time.
Brilliant, Robert. Thank you very much.